story my grandfather told me when I was 11 years old has haunted me ever since. Hardly a day goes by that I don't think about it. I was my grandfather's favorite and we spent many hours together where he would tell me about his life in the old country. His father was a banker, so he led a privileged life. He married into an aristocratic family and owned a shop where carriages were repaired and painted. He also was an artillery army officer who was expected to bravely stand in front of the cannons and direct their firing. This was to show the enemy that they were brave and not scared to die. Therefore they were normally the first to be killed. When it became evident that World War I was unavoidable and the near certain probability of my grandfather getting killed, he came to America. He settled in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, started a carriage painting shop and had a son and daughter. In 1939, 21 years after the end of World War I, the Second World War began. The US entered into the war with Germany in 1941 when I was 4 years old. To this day I vividly remember the horror I felt when it appeared that my father was going to be drafted and may never come back. Fortunately, he was given a deferment because of his critical employment. After the war ended in 1945, my father found out that he was on Hitler's list of wanted criminals. This seemed to make no sense. He had no connection to Germany or the war. My father emigrated from Croatia to America when he was only 2 years old and has never gone back. Why would the Nazis want to arrest my father? Years later, through correspondence that my grandfather had with relatives in Croatia, answers started to emerge. The Nazis thought that a member of my family was the leader of the local resistance movement. They had accounted for, or killed all of the male members of my family except my father. They knew he was born in Croatia, but they were unable to locate him. What they didn't realize is when he immigrated to America he was only listed as a child and not by his name. The Nazis assumed that he was still there and he was the right age and gender to lead the local underground. The Nazis were correct about the resistance being led by a member of my family. What they didn't realize was, it was a woman. For years she managed to destroy military equipment and harass the Germans, but her most spectacular accomplishment is only known by a few people. I will try to remember and relay the story that my grandfather told me about Stefika. Stefika was 33 years old, very attractive, and physically fit. She managed to get the attention of a high-ranking German officer and agreed to have sex with him and his bodyguard in exchange for food. During the encounter, the clothing and weapons of the two men were stolen by another underground member. Getting the uniforms was the objective of their plan. Nearby there was a major railroad track that was heavily guarded by the Germans. There were two classes of trains using these tracks. There was the regular freight traffic and the special high-speed military trains that carried war materials. The military trains were given priority over the others so they would not have to slow down or stop. When they were coming through, all other trains were put onto side tracks until they passed. The underground resistance determined that they could predict the timing of a military train by watching the activity of the German soldiers and the positioning of slow freight trains on side tracks. Finally everything came together. A military train was coming and there was a heavy freight train positioned close to the main line track switch. Two partisans with guns drawn, wearing the stolen German uniforms, walked behind Stefika, who had her hands over her head in a surrender pose. They were able to walk right up to the two soldiers that were guarding the track switch. They easily overpowered and tied up the soldiers. Stefika then strangled the two soldiers with her bare hands as to leave no marks, and their bodies were untied and placed on the side track. In this position they would be run over by the train if the switch was in the position diverting the train onto the siding. The tracks in this area were very straight and you could see for a long distance. Because there were no curves, the special train was traveling at a high rate of speed. The switch with its corresponding signal was set for the train to go straight through and continue on the main line. An instant before the train got to the switch, the resistance fighters pulled the lever diverting the train onto the side track and into the parked freight train. The military train consisted of a single locomotive followed by several freight cars filled with German troops. The next cars contained military equipment and explosives. The last cars contained gasoline. Fuel cars were always placed at the rear of the train in case they were shot at and caught on fire. This arrangement turned out to be disastrous for the Nazis because the fuel cars broke open and engulfed the entire wreck. There were no survivors. The Nazis would respond to any act of sabotage viciously. Not only would they execute the perpetrators but also their families. They might also execute innocent civilians to terrorize the community. What made this act so unique is the Nazis assumed that the guards realized that the switch was in the wrong position and tried to correct it. They were subsequently killed by the train. The Nazis therefore did not retaliate. The truth about the wreck was a very guarded secret and only known by a few people. No one dared to talk about it until long after the war ended. For years I wondered. Who was she? What was her name? How was I related to her? What did she look like? What happened to her? All of that information died with my grandfather when I was still young. After my father died, I was cleaning out his house and came across a wooden chest. In that chest were my grandfather's old records and photos. In the chest was a photograph of Stefika. Written on the back of the photo was 1945, Stefika, Viktor Majeric daughter, partisan, disappeared ? At last many of my questions were answered. Stefika was my grandfather's brother's daughter, which would make her my second cousin. The one question remaining was, what happened to her? Since the war was over when Stefika disappeared, it is unlikely that the Germans were involved. There was, however, many Nazi sympathizers and internal fighting in Croatia during the war. After the war ended, revenge killings were common. The most likely scenario is, she was killed by an opposing faction, but the truth will probably never be known. I still frequently think of Stefika and am proud to be related to her. I wish that I knew more about her when my daughter was born, because she would have been named Stefika.